Okay, this week, our big picture item is multiple intelligence theory, or multiple intelligences. So this was popularized by Howard Gardner, and originally he came up with 7, and then he added an 8th, which was naturalistic. I think he did that in the 90s, right around 92, 93. So for this week, we want to talk about multiple intelligence theory in terms of the activity that we're going to do in class. Last week we talked about social learning, and I just wanted to show you that connection from last week to this week. So we talked about cooperative learning and collaborative learning. That's going to relate to interpersonal versus intrapersonal intelligence. And we'll get to that in just a second, but I wanted to show you that there was a connection. Same thing in the next slide, interpersonal versus intrapersonal. Intrapersonal is knowing yourself. What can you do independently? You would have to know yourself to know, yes, I can handle some of these items independently. Some of these things I'm going to need help. And then the interpersonal is how do you communicate with other people to be as efficient as you can learning information from others. So working within a group is interpersonal communication. So let's go back to multiple intelligence theory for just a second. And so you have visual spatial. For me, and I'm going to talk in terms of my own learning, this is one of the top ways that I like to learn. And I like to see things visually. And you'll notice that I talk a lot of times with my hands. And it's because I'm visualizing what I'm referring to. So visual spatial learning, not only do I teach education, but I also teach kinesiology. So you can see why that is an important part of my learning. Being able to move myself through space, being able to visualize what I'm doing. What I want you to think about as we go through each one of these is the activity. Even if I haven't introduced the activity yet, just think of activities in general and how you learn from hands-on methods. So do you like to see things visually if it's a new skill that you're learning? I do. I want to see it acted out. Then linguistic verbal, that's not the top for me. So that's one of my weaker areas. So you can obviously tell that I have this thick country accent, and that kind of gets in the way. My verbal communication is not the best. I'm not the best listener either, so I don't like to learn through listening. Now, if you pair that with visual spatial information, I do well. And most people do. And most of us are multimodal learners, and we'll talk about that when we get to the VARK inventory and learning style for the second part of the week. I would say the top 2 modes, research shows us that it's visual spatial paired with verbal linguistic, meaning if I'm showing you something, it may not mean a lot unless I'm giving a verbal description of what I'm doing. So for most people, research shows they like to not only see it, but they like to hear it at the same time. And then bodily kinesthetic. For me, that's a huge component, especially with something that's going to be hands-on. I need to actually physically manipulate the activity to learn it. So like if you were going to teach me, which we're going to do next class, knot tying, very difficult for me just to see the knot and pick it up. Now I'm trying to break it down, so I need to see it, so that's visual. You're going to have to tell me what you're doing as you go along through it, but I actually need to physically manipulate that rope and tie the knot myself. Once I do that, I've got it. So that would probably be one of my tops is bodily kinesthetic, learning something through tactile sensation, actually going through the motions. Here's another one of my weak areas is musical rhythmic. I have no rhythm. Even though I can learn things kinesthetically, I'm not very rhythmic and I'm not very musical. And then logical mathematical, I'm actually fairly good with that because it's procedural, it's process oriented. So it is on the implicit side of the house, meaning that order of operations, that's all procedure, and I can memorize those procedures fairly well. So initially, when I started school, I thought I was terrible at And then naturalistic. I am a naturalistic learner. So that would be somebody into biology, into hunting, tracking, primitive skills, wilderness survival, ethnobotany, anything that revolves around nature, I'm definitely a naturalistic learner. And a lot of these activities that we do in class, those that are naturalistic will pick those up quite well. Now, here are the two topics that most students get confused. They are connected to last week. You have interpersonal communication. How do you work with other people? Like your ability to communicate with other people within groups. So that's why I have you in groups, is so that you can practice that and you can work out any problems before you get into your career. That's why a lot of college classes, we have you working in groups. So you can learn how to deal with all those different personalities. But in order to do that well, you have to know yourself, and that is interpersonal communication. So knowing oneself is interpersonal communication. So if you know that you're an introvert, you may not want to choose to be a leader for a group, or at least not right away. If that's something you want to work on, don't shy away from it. But it may be something you want to build into. You may not want to just jump into it directly, because it may create some anxiety for you. So knowing yourself helps you interact with other people, interpersonal. If you have characteristics that other people find annoying, you may want to, I'm not saying not be yourself, but depending on the people that you're around, kind of regulate that to a certain level. If you have things that people really like, maybe you want to bring those things out when you work in groups. Something that's always worked well for you, you've got to know yourself. So if you're an extrovert, maybe you want to be that leader. If you're an introvert, maybe you want to take a role that is your strength, but not necessarily a leadership role. But again, I don't want to shy you away from working on your weaknesses. If you feel that that is a weakness, work on it, but do it incrementally. Don't take on too much at one time. So interpersonal, knowing how to work within a group. Intrapersonal is knowing yourself, and that's important so that you can work within the group. All right, that's multiple intelligence theory. I don't want to go too far into that. I showed you how that was also connected to a zone of proximal development, which we talked about in the last class period. You're going to find that there's things that you can do independently, and that is knowing that about yourself is intrapersonal communication. And you're going to have things that you need help from. And being a good group member, knowing how to work within group, and be patient with other people, that's all interpersonal communication. And then that's going to take us into learning styles, VARK inventory. So we would have done that at the beginning of the semester, assessed your learning styles. And now we're going to be able to put that into practice in class. Now, for this week, the activity that we're going to do, I want you to think about which of these multiple intelligences tie into the activity for you. What are your top three? That's really what you want to talk about in your video when it comes to the activity. So I'm going to demo the activity. I'm just going to use a primitive fire example. You may be in a different class and maybe we're doing different activities, but at least you can kind of see how this would flow. So if we're doing primitive fire, in social learning theory, I would have taught you how to make a tinder bundle, because that is like the base skill. You want to have all your resources together before you make an ember. Otherwise, you can't. That ember may go out before you get a tinder bundle together, or maybe you can't find the resources. And then the next class period is actually how to build the best fire structure for that tinder bundle to go in. This week is about making cordage, because so many of the activities that we're going to do, like the one in the next class, is going to be knot tying. So what happens if you don't have cordage? Well, to tie a knot with. This class would be, how do we make cordage out of material? So I'm going to teach you reverse wrap, and I'm going to teach you braiding. So of those multiple intelligences, which are most important for that? For me, it would be visual spatial. I would want to see how these different methods of making cordage work. I'd want somebody to describe what they're doing, but I would also want to get some hands-on learning. And if we're using natural fibers, that's naturalistic learning. And if you're learning from somebody else, that's interpersonal communication. But you need to understand yourself and how you learn. That's intrapersonal. So understanding that I'd want these big three first when I'm learning a new skill. That's what you're going to talk about in your activity. Which of these multiple intelligence relate to the activity for you and your group to complete the activity correctly, get it videotaped, get it chopped together? Which ones are your go-to multiple intelligence or multiple intelligences, modes of learning?